Well, hi, everybody, and thank you for joining us. My name is David Robinson. I'm the Director of Membership and Meetings for the Linguistic Society of America, the LSA, which is sponsoring this webinar. My preferred pronouns are he, him, and his. Thank you very much for taking the time to be with us, and we're going to wait just a couple more minutes to get started until we can wait for the rest of our attendees to log on. So bear with us, and we'll get started in just a few minutes. Thanks. Okay, I think we can go ahead and get started. Again, everyone, thank you for joining us. My name is David Robinson. I'm the Director of Membership and Meetings for the Linguistic Society of America, the LSA, which is sponsoring this webinar. While I'm talking, you'll be seeing a brief slideshow about the LSA and what we do. And on the last slide, which I think is on your screen now, you'll see information about a special membership discount for participants in this webinar. By the way, my preferred pronouns are he, him, and his. And before I turn the floor over to our panelists, I want to take just a few minutes to let you know how the webinar will work and to make sure you're familiar with the GoToWebinar control panel. So the panel is probably going to be by default on the right side of your screen. You'll see a handouts widget there, and we have copies of the panelists' slideshows in there that you can download at any time during the webinar. If you forget to do that, don't worry. We'll have copies available on the LSA website as well, and we'll tell you how to find those later. Also, you may have noticed that your microphones are muted. That's so we don't get miscellaneous background noise from the 100 of you that are in the audience. So when it comes time for question and answer, you can use the questions widget that you'll see on your dashboard to ask questions. Just when the time comes, ask your questions there. And if your question is for a specific panelist, please let us know which one. Finally, we want to take just a couple of short polls so that our panelists can get a better sense of who you all are. There are two very short polls with one question apiece, so they won't take much time to get through. I'm going to open the first one right now. So I'm starting this one, and you can answer more than one. You can choose more than one answer. Okay, great. I see the voting is proceeding. We'll wait just a few more moments and make sure everyone's been able to vote, and then I will display the results for you. Okay, let's go ahead and close this poll, and then we'll display the results. Okay, and you should be able to see the poll results on your screen now. So 73% of you are LGBTQ plus, 29% are allies. 63 of you are seeking to promote LGBTQ plus issues in the wider linguistics circle, and 33% of you are seeking to organize. So the other poll is also really quick, and I start that. It just asks about your academic status, and this is a one answer poll. So if you go ahead and answer that. Okay, I think just about everyone has voted. I'll go ahead and close this poll and share the results with you. And you should be able to see the results now. Okay, 90% undergraduates, 42% graduate students, 27% faculty, and 12% of you are there. So I'm going to go ahead and hide that poll. Just a couple more things. This webinar, as you may have seen, is being interpreted for the deaf. So there are going to be 2 interpreters working in separate video channels. And if necessary, you can enlarge any webcam at any time. There should be an arrow on the webcam that will enable you to make it bigger. Okay, so that's all the introduction. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce Tyler Kibbe. He will be introducing himself and the other panelists. Tyler is one of the co-conveners of the LSA's new Special Interest Group on LGBTQ plus issues in linguistics. And also, coincidentally, he is a former intern at the LSA. Tyler might not tell you this himself, but he just received an Academic Advancement Award from the Tennessee LGBT plus College Conference. He was recognized for his research on anti-LGBTQ plus religious language, his programming work at the University of Tennessee and the University of Kentucky, and his organizational work at the LSA in founding and co-convening the Special Interest Group. Go ahead and take it away.
Okay, hello everyone. Thanks for being with us here today. So like David said, I'm the co-convener of the LSA Special Interest Group on LGBTQ Issues in Linguistics, and I'm a master's student at the University of Kentucky in the Department of Linguistics. So today the webinar is going to be based off of the LGBTQ Linguistics panel from the previous 2019 annual meeting. And so with me, we'll be seeing Jeremy Calder and Kirby Conrad, who were both panelists at that panel. We're going to be exploring some more informal topics as well as some more formal methodological and theoretical topics. So we're going to be hearing about different perspectives in LGBTQ linguistics from a postdoctoral fellow, a PhD candidate, and a master's student, myself. So first, I'd like to introduce the first speaker, who's going to be Jeremy Calder, they, them, theirs. Jeremy is a Chancellor's Postdoctoral Fellow in the Department of Linguistics at the University of Colorado Boulder. Their work straddles the fields of sociolinguistic variation and linguistic anthropology. Using sociophonetic and ethnographic methods, they explore how phonetic variation is used in the articulation of marginalized identities. After Jeremy, we're going to hear from Kirby Conrad, they, them, theirs, who is a doctoral candidate in the Department of Linguistics at the University of Washington. Their dissertation explores third-person pronouns in English from a syntactic and sociolinguistic perspective. Using evidence from complex pronoun constructions and from ongoing language change around singular use of they propose a new underlying syntactic structure of pronouns. Again, thank you for being with us here today, and I'll hand it over to our first presenter, Jeremy. Thanks.
All right, so hopefully everyone can hear me, but I'm on a phone right now, so I'm not able to, unfortunately, share my screen. So David is kind enough to go ahead and share my presentation for me, so I'll be communicating to him when the slides need to change. But today I'm going to be doing kind of an informal overview of who I am as both a person and a researcher, and how that relates to the work that I do, and kind of exploring how the positionality of the researcher can relate to the research that's being done by that person. I'm going to be exploring kind of what the implications are of your identity overlapping with that of your subjects. And when you're part of the community you are researching or writing about, and what that overlap might mean for knowledge production and the analyses of the practices of the people in the community that you're looking at. So you can go ahead and go to the next slide. So sociolinguistics, generally, I'm sure there's people from a bunch of different fields in this webinar right now, so I'm just going to provide a broad overview. But generally, sociolinguistics looks at how different people speak differently, and what the differences in the ways people speak say about who the speakers are, like the groups they belong to, things they orient to, different contexts they're in, things like that. Recently, there's maybe in the past couple decades, there's been a movement toward increasingly incorporating ethnographic methods in sociolinguistic research. So basically in a traditional ethnography, a researcher goes into a community and spends time with that community for a length of time in order to kind of understand the practices and the perspectives of people in that community. And so recent research has kind of found that things can mean different things in different communities, just depending on the specific norms of the community you're looking at. So a lot of the social meaning or the social connotations of different linguistic variables that are used are context dependent and kind of depend on what the norms of that community are. So people can use ethnographic methods in order to gain insight about what the norms of the community are, in order to inform their interpretations of the linguistic practices that are happening in those communities. So traditionally, ethnography is, a researcher is kind of an outsider. A researcher is not part of the community, and the researcher spends a length of time with that community in order to become familiar with the way that community views things. But recently, there's been more and more people incorporating things like autoethnography or native ethnographies, where people are actually community members themselves, and they research their own communities and kind of present knowledge based on that. And I'm a researcher that has done that, and I'll be talking a little bit about that today. Usually when I give talks about my work, the most I say about myself is I am a community member. But I'm going to be going in a little bit more detail about who I am and my identity and my personal experiences, and how that kind of has informed the way that I've interpreted things in my research with a community of non-binary drag queens in San Francisco. So you can move to the next slide. So this feels kind of weird having pictures of myself, but I guess since you guys can't see me on webcam, it's just as well. But who I am, I'm a lot of things. So I'm queer, I'm non-binary, I identify as femme, I'm a drag queen, I'm a sociophonetician, I'm a linguistic anthropologist. So there's a lot of different hats or wigs I can wear. And one of the dilemmas I've kind of faced moving through navigating the field and navigating academia is whether to compartmentalize those different aspects of my identity or to consolidate them and let them inform each other. So there's certain scenarios where, you know, I might refrain, even though I identify as non-binary and I identify as femme, I might refrain from presenting in a femme way in a professional context, because that might have certain implications about professionalism or appropriateness. So there's certain ways that I might compartmentalize, but then there's other ways that I might consolidate and let my perspective as a queer person of color who has navigated the world with certain social positionalities. There's certain ways that I let that inform the way that I approach my research and the way that I'm able to understand certain communities based on the lived experiences that I've had as a person with certain overlapping dimensions of identity. So yeah, on the left, that's me more in an academic situation, and on the right, that's my drag persona Novelli. I'm actually so I've been performing in drag for probably over a decade now, and I was a member of this San Francisco community I'm going to be talking about that I have done work with. And I think I was part of that community for about 5 years. So we can go ahead and go to the next slide. So what my research focuses on is the idea of gender performativity. So kind of this idea proposed by Judith Butler that gender is something that is accomplished through things people do, rather than something that is inherent to somebody based on the body they were born into. So people do gender instead of being gender. People do male, people do female, people do non-binary, people do masculinity, just based on societal norms for what those things mean and actions that kind of reference those norms. And the actions people do are kind of going to either conform to those norms or not. So I'm really interested in how gender non-normative people navigate social situations, and how they kind of make sense of themselves, since there are these norms for what masculinity and femininity are. And I'm particularly interested in how do people that identify as non-binary or non-normative make sense of themselves socially. So what I look at is I look at phonetic variables and visual presentation. So there are a bunch of studies of phonetic variables that have been done, basically trying to pinpoint. Basically, when people hear voices, they think that the voice sounds gendered, or that the voice sounds gay, or the voice sounds straight. So there's been a lot of research on the phonetic sources of what makes a voice sound gay, straight, masculine, feminine, normative, non-normative. And also, visual presentation is undeniably important when it comes to gender performance, because people, the way that you adorn your body, the way that you move your body, kind of references those norms of masculinity and femininity. And if people are doing that visual in a way that doesn't conform to social expectations, there might be social consequences to that. So I kind of look at how phonetic variables and visual presentation kind of interact, and what that means for the communication of social meaning, and the communication of gender performance or gender identity. And the main variable that I've spent a lot of time looking at is the fronting of the S sound. So the S sound is something that has been looked at quite a bit in phonetic research, because there's this folk ideology of the gay lisp. Basically, this idea that lisping is a feminine or a gay sound. And when I say gay, I'm talking about quote unquote gay males. And basically, what phonetic research has found is that the positioning of your tongue in relation to your teeth when you're pronouncing the S kind of changes the sound of the S. So when you pronounce an S, you are putting your tongue on the alveolar ridge, which is that bump on the top of your mouth behind your top teeth, and you're passing air over it. And however close or far your tongue is compared to your teeth, that kind of changes the size of the cavity between the tongue and your teeth, and it makes the hissing sound higher or lower. So if your tongue is fronter, the hissing sound is going to be a higher frequency, and that's what people have called fronted S. And fronted S has been found in a bunch of production and perception research to kind of correlate with things like femininity, femaleness, male queerness. So basically, if fronted S emerges from a voice that's perceived as male, it's perceived as queer because it doesn't conform to the way that people think male sounding voices sound. So I look at fronted S in this community of drag queens, and how it kind of interacts with the way that they dress themselves, visually, using like hair, makeup, wigs, and stuff like that. So the next slide. So the community that I was a part of and that I will be talking about is a community of drag queens in a neighborhood called Soma in San Francisco, and it's named Soma for south of Market Street. So Market Street is kind of the main street in San Francisco, and Soma, you can see there in purple, it's just below Market Street, and downtown is just above Market Street. So Soma has long been an industrial neighborhood, a kind of working class neighborhood, but it's rapidly gentrifying right now. And Soma has also long been home to queer communities, especially non-normative queer communities, like the BDSM community. Folsom Street Fair takes place in Soma. And for people that don't know what BDSM is, it's like alternative sex practices. It's bondage, discipline, sadism, masochism. There's also a community of alternative drag queens in Soma that kind of emerged in response to the 1990s .com boom, which was the first wave of gentrification to hit Soma. And in response to that, there was a collective of drag queens that kind of formed in Soma, doing shows like, it's a controversial name now, but at the time it was called Tranny Shack. And it was a legendary show in San Francisco that kind of had a punk rock vibe to it and was responding to the gentrification that was threatening the presence of the queer community in Soma. Now, when I entered Soma, it was in kind of a second wave of alternative drag. So the Tranny Shack wave was kind of the first wave of alternative drag in Soma. And I entered in the 2010s during the second tech boom that's happening now, where there's a bunch of tech startups sprouting up all over San Francisco, particularly in Soma because its location is so convenient compared to downtown. But it's prime real estate, and a lot of startups are headquartered in Soma, including even big companies like Twitter are headquartered in Soma. And that is kind of threatening the long-standing queer spaces that have been in the neighborhood since the late 60s, like the Stud, which has been around since 1969, and was in danger of closing because of this competition for real estate, where the owner wanted to triple the rent of the Stud. So basically, the queens that exist in Soma are kind of threatened in a very real way by this gentrification that's happening right now, and they are they're positioned uniquely in response to this threat of increasing normativity in the city. So the Soma drag is very non-normative, and it's very gritty. It's very punk rock. It has an influence from the BDSM community that has been there for a long time. And a lot of the individuals that perform in the Soma community, myself included, are not only drag queens, but also identify as queer in some way that relates to gender. So a lot of people in the community are non-binary. So that means that they identify as neither male nor female. And non-binariness can manifest in a range of ways. But many of the queens, although they were assigned male gender at birth based on their body configurations, they identify with femininity, and they kind of embrace femininity both on stage and off stage, both as a drag queen on stage and as a feminine non-binary person off stage. And that's a perspective that I have lived and shared with many members of the community that I have interviewed for this project. You can go ahead to the next slide. So just to show the tension between queerness and the tech boom that's happening right now, where the techies are kind of positioned as normative, and the queer individuals in the neighborhood are positioned as anti-normative. So as the techies come into the city, there is this persona, this stereotypical persona of what the techie is, and it's usually a white straight male, and a white straight male that has a lot of money, and that contrasts with the kind of positionality of a lot of the queens in this community, where many of them don't identify as cis. Many of they're not straight. They're not normative. So there's a lot of tension between the queer community and the increasing presence of techies in the city, as you can see by the sidewalk graffiti that's pictured here. And there are many similar graffitis. I don't know, I guess graffiti is already a plural, but there are many similar spray paint where it says queers hate techies, pretty much all over the neighborhood, all over Soma and the neighboring neighborhood of the Mission. So you can go to the next slide. So Soma drag is a very particular kind of drag. It's not beauty drag, it's not glamorous drag. There has been some pioneering work done by Rusty Barrett on drag queens, African-American drag queens in Texas. And he kind of talks about the difference between glam drag and messy drag, where glam drag queens are trying to visually present a flawless, conventional vision of femininity and hide any visual signals that might conjure up masculinity ideologically. So they'll shave their legs so there's no body hair. They will wear things in a way to proportion themselves to minimize certain ratios of body parts that might index masculinity for people. Whereas Soma queens, since many of them are non-binary, they also have a non-normative approach to the way they do drag. So they do embody femininity visually using resources like thigh-high boots or corsets or skirts or fishnet stockings or high-heeled shoes. But there's also this intentional non-normativity to it where they don't necessarily try to hide visual signals that might index masculinity. So many don't shave their legs, many don't shave their armpits. Some of them don't tuck, which tucking is a practice where a drag queen will, a male identified drag queen will use duct tape to basically pull their genitalia back to hide the bulge, so you don't see the bulge. But in Soma, there are queens like the one you see on the left that don't tuck. So even though they are visually embodying femininity, they're visually embodying it in a very non-normative way that doesn't necessarily conform to conventional expectations. So you can go to the next slide. So given that they identify with femininity and non-normativity, I explored how they pronounce this S sound that has been robustly shown in the literature to pattern with respect to gender and sexuality. So on the bottom, you see, so I was looking at male assigned individuals for this study. So I looked at 8 male assigned drag queens in Soma, and I looked at their pronunciation of S and compared them with male identified people from previous studies. So the male identified people from previous studies are below the horizontal axis, and the Soma queens are plotted above the horizontal axis. And you can see that basically there's this measure of center of gravity, which measures how high the frequency of the hiss of S is, and the higher the center of gravity is, the higher the frequency of the hiss is, and the more fronted the articulation of the S's. So as you can see, the Soma queens are mostly, almost all of them are way fronter than even the frontist speaker groups from previous studies, which are the gay men from Zimmins 2012 study in San Francisco. So you can see that the Soma queens are really using this phonetic resource that indexes queerness and indexes femininity to a degree that surpasses other gay men in the city. And there's something to be said about that. There's this social meaning of this hyper queerness, this hyper non-normativity, this hyper femininity that they're doing there. You can go to the next slide. So here is a quantitative visualization. So I conducted conversations with these queens as they visually transformed. So at the beginning of the conversation, they visually presented in a way that might be read by an interlocutor as closer to conventionally male. And over the course of the transformation, they increasingly use visual signals like eyelashes, eyeliner, makeup contouring, wigs, cinching garments to basically embody this drag persona and kind of visually inscribe this non-normativity onto their bodies. So I looked at phonetic changes over the course of the visual transformation. And you can see here what this plot is basically showing you is on the x-axis is time, and on the y-axis is how loud the S is compared to the adjacent segment. So what they're doing is, as they get into drag, the S is actually becoming louder. What they're doing is kind of acoustically underscoring that fronted S that is indexing that femininity and queerness for them as they get into drag. So as they increasingly embody this non-normative persona, they're kind of acoustically underscoring the variable that is indexing the same gender non-normativity. So you can go to the next slide. So how do I know these things? Where does my knowledge come from? And I guess I want to think a little bit about the role of the I in linguistics, especially sociolinguistics. So there's this dichotomy of the person versus the researcher. So how do I, as the person that I am, how does my personhood influence the research that I'm doing and the way that I'm interpreting the research that I'm doing? Because even though we want linguistics to be a science, and I think there's this idea that there's this objective truth that we're searching for when we're looking at communities. So we want to be as objective. The conventional idea is that the researcher wants to be as objective as possible when entering a community, so as to minimize any biases they might have. So that's kind of what ethnography usually does. That relationship between the researcher and community is something that's really illuminated with ethnography. So usually, traditionally, the researcher is supposed to be an outsider to the community, and they're supposed to spend enough time with the community so that their own perspectives and positionalities don't override the perspectives and positionalities of the people in the community itself. And it's undeniable that every person that moves through the world has certain social positions. Like me, for example, me as a male assigned person who identifies as femme, who is a person of color, who is queer, who is non-binary, I experience the world differently than somebody that maybe has different dimensions to their identity. And because we experience that world differently, we have different lived experiences that inform our perspectives and inform the ways that we interpret social action. So ethnography traditionally is trying to minimize the interference between the own researcher's positionality and the positionality of the people in the community by spending enough time with the people in the community so that you understand their positionality. But what if the researcher already shares the perspective of the members of the community? What if the researcher is part of the community and is part of not only transmitting the knowledge, so not just transmitting the epistemology that is constructed within the community, but also co-constructs that knowledge with people in the community. So for me, as a member of the community, I'm co-constructing this epistemology, these epistemological frameworks that the community is operating under. So I'm part of the knowledge production as well as the transmission of knowledge. And I think we can even say that any person that enters a situation with their own unique positionality is going to affect the social dynamics of that situation. So there's always going to be some kind of co-construction of social dynamics and co-construction of epistemology happening. So we should really be thinking about what are our unique perspectives as a person, what are our unique perspectives as a researcher. What can our own experiences and backgrounds bring to the table? Because we are always bringing to the table the social epistemologies that we've kind of developed through our lived experiences. So those perspectives are going to inform the way that we're interpreting the communities, the questions that we're asking, the way that we're interpreting the data that is in front of us. Those are going to inform the relationships between the researcher or the ethnographer and the communities they're studying. And we need to be conscious about the ways that we as researchers are kind of inserting ourselves into these discussions. So as researchers, when we enter a community, we are inserting ourselves into the discussion of what it means to be a member of this community. So we need to really think about whether we're an outsider or an insider, how are we inserting ourselves into that discussion? What are the benefits to being an outsider versus being an insider? And inserting ourselves as an outsider into the discussion might have the benefit of you are able to see something that is different from your own epistemological framework that might not register as noteworthy to members in the community. But maybe if you're an insider, you are able to more accurately interpret the social meaning of the practices that are happening because you operate under the same epistemological framework as the members of the community do. So there's kind of benefits of sharing the local epistemology that the researcher has co-constructed with the community that they're looking at. So there are these different methods of kind of getting at what are the epistemological frameworks that the communities are operating under. And this kind of brings us to the question of like, what is a valid study? What is real linguistics? Because there's this idea that real linguistics is objective. And I'm going a little bit over, but this is my last slide. But there's this idea that real linguistics is objective, and we are going to be informed by the data that we're looking at. But when you're introducing social dynamics, you cannot divorce the data from the social dynamics that the data are situated within. So we have to really consider more deeply how those epistemologies are both transmitted and co-constructed, and what our roles as researchers, whether insider or outsiders to the community, are contributing to that epistemology. And that's it. I went way over, but thank you.
Ooh, I think I'm supposed to just take over now, but I have to get the screen. Thank you, Jeremy, for that really amazing talk. I really love thinking about positionality. I am theoretically showing my screen now. So my talk, I think in a lot of ways, I'm going to be talking about things that sort of jump off of what you're talking about. And I'm really excited to come after you so that I can try and talk to the stuff that you have put on the table here. I am coming at this panel looking at sort of, I'm also going to be sharing some of my personal experiences and the way that they intersect with my research. And I'm also going to be talking a little bit about the sort of scholarly environment and the professional environment that we occupy in linguistics, and for me especially as a sort of very overtly trans in certain ways. So I'm going to be talking about that, and also how that intersects with informing research methods and informing scholarly activities in general. So a little bit about me. I am in my 5th year of my PhD. I am due to graduate any minute now. And I'm sort of in that stage where all I do is write dissertation and then lay around complaining about how I can't write my dissertation, and that's all I do now. But it will be over soon. I am non-binary, and I use non-binary sort of as an umbrella term. If I had to locate myself in the non-binary umbrella, I would put myself probably close to agender, which is sort of this feeling of, for me personally, being agender is a little bit about feeling alienated from the gender system and sort of wanting to opt out. And so there are various ways that I sort of navigate that, and I can talk about that in a minute, especially in the context of being a graduate student and a linguist. But
sorry to interrupt. Would you mind turning your webcam on?
Oh, sure. Can it also be on with my screen?
It can, yeah.
Wow.
Yep, there you are.
Okay. Is it okay that I have it? Can you still see my PowerPoint?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, I believe you. Thank you. Oh, I'm talking about my gender, I guess. Yes. I also, part of what informs both my research and sort of my experience as a non-binary person in grad school is that I didn't start transitioning socially or medically until I got to grad school. Like pretty much my first year was about figuring that out, while also figuring out how to be in grad school, and that was a pretty exciting year or two, and in some ways it really informed the directions that my research took after that. And the ways that sort of this is the most overt is that my experience of socially transitioning, a lot of it involved asking people to use singular they when talking about me, and I sort of encountered a lot of resistance about that. And one of the things that you hear, especially if singular they is the only pronoun that you're really okay with, is you hear from a lot of people that it's ungrammatical for them. And this really, as a syntactician, drew me to, well, why would that be? Because it clearly isn't ungrammatical for anybody. And that's really informed a huge part of my research. And then the other thing that's informed a lot of my research is encountering a lot of linguistics research, and this is getting better as we go, but linguistics research that is taught in sort of introductory classes, where I kept running into this problem of like, what about trans people? You know, when you sit in an introductory sociolinguistics class, what about trans people is like a huge sort of elephant in the room. So it's something that I really kept coming back to. So my research sort of throughout the course of being in grad school, I started out researching the syntax of pronominal relative clauses, which is just what it sounds like, which is pronouns with relative clauses in it. It ended up being very syntaxy and very about relative clauses, which is fine. But what happened as I was researching that was that I kept running into sort of conflict between theoretical accounts of pronouns and what I was experiencing every day, where people would switch pronouns talking about a single person, or people would switch pronouns like in the course of a single conversation. And I was really interested about how that was happening specifically around trans people, and how pronouns sort of get socially negotiated. So my second big project was focused on eliciting third-person pronouns about real reference and about trans reference, and looking at what are the social factors that go into who is misgendering whom. So who is using pronouns in a way that is not the preferred way for the referent to be talking about them. So the design for this study was, there's not a lot of sort of methods for intentionally eliciting pronouns, because we sort of background it so much that we don't really think about how to get somebody to say a pronoun on purpose, because we figure that they just will at some point. So one of the challenges of this project was to develop a methodology where I could put people in a social situation where I could control a little bit of the reference, but still allow for very naturalistic pronoun use. And so what I ended up doing was I ended up pairing people and interviewing people in pairs, and talking about just, you know, getting to know you questions, and then splitting them up and interviewing them about each other. So sort of like intentionally invoking almost like a gossip situation. And this ended up being really effective for getting people to use pronouns about each other. And because of the way that I recruited for this study, it was very effective in getting people to use pronouns about real trans people that they had to meet. And some of these groups were people who brought a friend in, and some of these groups were strangers that I matched up. And what I looked at was some measures of explicit and implicit bias against trans people, and how those correlated with how much are you misgendering actual trans people. And what I found was that people who are sort of unconsciously transphobic do misgender actual trans people more, which to me wasn't a surprising finding, but it was really sort of exciting to find it on a piece of paper, like with a math associated with it. It was very validating. Sort of building off of these projects, my dissertation has been very focused on looking at pronouns in their social context, but also looking at how formal models, my background training is as a generative syntactician, and I work mainly in minimalism, and there are a lot of minimalist syntacticians who sort of don't try to deal with any social stuff. And there are many minimalist syntacticians who are starting to get on the sociolinguistics party bus, but what I'm really interested in with this work is looking at really digging into the syntax and semantics of pronouns in a way that challenges some of the sort of received knowledge. One of these things that gets really frustrating is when you're sitting in your introduction to semantics class and you get the example of John likes herself with a star on it, and you think to yourself, well, I don't know what gender John is. And it's frustrating coming at this from a perspective of being trans and non-binary, being embedded in a trans and non-binary social context, and then seeing this really sort of sterile, artificial model of language that you haven't really heard anybody question this before. So I am really interested in questioning this. So part of the work of this dissertation has been especially tracking, looking at the way that singular they is interacting with the pronominal paradigm in English. And that means one of the ways that I'm looking at it is sort of from a variationist sociolinguistics perspective, and tracking what looks like basically a change over time where more and more people are using it in a definite and referential way. And the people who are reporting that it's ungrammatical are mostly like older people. And this isn't exclusively one way or the other, but there is a definite trend. But also looking at if you have a grammar that allows you to use singular they with a proper name, there's a bunch of pragmatic moves that you can make that are sort of reliant on having more than two options. So I am very interested in the ways that pronouns as a social resource get deployed, and in order to look at that, I've been really looking at places where people will change pronouns over the course of a conversation, or places where people have an option between one or two pronouns and they have to make a choice. And then sort of using this data to build it into a minimalist syntax account. A lot of my public work lately has been about sort of the sociolinguistic side. So I have been talking a lot lately about changes in singular they and alternations of pronouns and misgendering. I also recently have been talking about ways that we should think about approaching gender and sex from sort of a method standpoint in sociolinguistics. And I can talk a little more about that during the question and answer session, but it's something that I'm very interested in because it's something where I see people sort of coming at this work curious but a little bit naive. And so one of the things that I think is important for sociolinguists who have a good grasp of gender right now is to build a framework for other people to sort of hang their research on. And one of the things that I'm interested in looking at soon is sort of how people learn to use pronouns that they're not used to. And this means a couple different sort of dimensions. So one of the things that people will find or people will report is that if you've known somebody for a long time and you've been calling them she for a long time, and then they ask you to use he, people will report that that's difficult and that it takes time to learn. But other people will report, oh, I just did it and it's fine. So I'm really interested in looking at how people learn to change pronouns, especially over time, and also how they learn to incorporate a new pronoun into their sort of inventory. So people who maybe 10 years ago did not use singular they that much, but now they use it very comfortably. And then some of my sort of future directions are looking more at how non-binary speakers navigate languages with a lot more sort of morphosyntactic structure around gender. So these are languages where you have gendered verb agreement, or all your nouns have gender marking on them, or something like this. So this is sort of the direction that I'm hoping to go in. Over the course of being in grad school and being in sort of professional linguistics, I have had these experiences of sort of some difficulty navigating, especially the pronouns thing, but not always just pronouns, where as a grad student, I interact a lot with undergrads and I interact a lot with faculty, and I will find myself sort of getting misgendered from both sides. And this is something that was much more frustrating when I was sort of starting out and really struggling to get people to recognize my own right to define my gender in a lot of ways. But it's something that is also sort of weird to navigate in an interpersonal way, because, you know, correcting people doesn't always work. So this is something where over the times that I've been sort of in professional academia, I will correct somebody because they used the wrong pronoun about me, and I'll get various responses like, oh, I'm trying to use the right pronoun, but it's hard. And this is something that sometimes is sort of part of the conversation about the grammaticality of singular they, but sometimes it's not. I also get this sort of navigating power imbalances. So times when I've been a TA for a faculty member who doesn't really feel secure using singular they to talk about me, and also specifically tells me that I can't correct them in front of students. So this is the sort of thing of like feeling like people are sort of directly leveraging their professional sort of position over me as a way of saying, you know, your feelings of gender congruity are less important than my feelings of authority in front of the students that we interact with. And then I've had much more extreme responses to talking about pronouns in public, where, you know, some people have responded really, I don't want to say emotionally, but a little bit emotionally, where people feel really restricted when I ask them to use a certain pronoun, or when I suggest that if they can't grammatically use singular they have the option of not using pronouns at all, as opposed to misgendering non-binary people. And this is something where people who feel really strongly about this will feel that I'm impinging upon their sort of autonomy over how they speak, and this leads to really embarrassing public exchanges. It hasn't been all bad. So I have found that people have gotten better over time. Part of this may be that I have been really pushy about it and people have just gotten used to me. But part of it, I think, is also a change over time, just in terms of how people feel about singular they as sort of a pronoun in use. So I taught a class of 30 students this quarter. I just read my teaching evals last week, and as always, I have some good ones and some bad ones, but all my students used singular they or avoided pronouns. Not one of them misgendered me. And this is even the negative. The students who really didn't like me still didn't misgender me. So that's something that like is not always true. And when it is true, it's really satisfying to be like, oh, well, thank you for taking this sort of one thing that you don't like out of your repertoire of ways to be mean to me. But I think it's really indicative of students being more aware of what's going on, and it's encouraging to me to see that. The other thing that I've seen is that there's a lot more sort of public understanding and awareness and discussion around pronouns and around singular they, and that's something where linguists researching singular they has been really helpful for sort of exposing people to the idea that it's just a part of language, and that it's a part of language that signals respect and politeness. And I think that approaching it as linguists has been really helpful to communicating to other linguists how to act around trans people, basically in a way that's not disrespectful. So this is something where I've had some negative experiences, but I've also had some positive experiences, and I feel like the trajectory over time has been getting better. I want to talk a little bit about how, so I am working in this webinar under the assumption that you're here a little bit because you are LGBT, and based on the poll that we had at the beginning, it sounds like a lot of you are, but I'm also sort of coming in with the idea that you are also here because you want linguistics and professional and scholarly linguistics to be a welcoming environment for LGBT people. So I want to talk a little bit about some specific moves that we can encourage for people to make linguistics more welcoming of trans linguists. So one of the first things is something that I really appreciate David doing this as sort of part of introducing himself in the beginning of this webinar, because it's something that I really like to see normalized. I really like to see people who aren't trans putting pronouns on their name tags or in their email signatures or in their Twitter bios, because it really makes it feel more like sort of a normal standard way of introducing yourself, and it makes it less weird when I do it. So this is something where even as an instructor myself, introducing myself as non-binary and talking about my pronouns on the first day of class on syllabus day has made my undergrad students feel a lot more comfortable about sharing their pronouns with their classmates and myself, but also about sort of demanding respect, the respect that they're really owed. So this is something that is really easy for everybody to do, of just make it a standard way of part of how you introduce yourself. The other thing that I think is something we as linguists are gonna have an easier time at this, but I really wanna see linguists setting a good example for the public and talking about it. But I think that, we all, almost everybody who has to go through a linguistics PhD has to fill some language requirement, and it requires some sort of cognitive flexibility of learning a second language or a third or a fourth language, where you have to do something in communicating that you're not used to doing. And one of the things that I'm asking linguists to do is to push some of your good language brain power towards being flexible with pronouns. So this is something where you can practice in private. This slide actually has a link. So if you can see my mouse, I'm hovering over it, but you should be able to click on this link, I think. But there are apps online and also phone apps that will let you sort of practice certain pronouns or sets of pronouns if you find that you are sort of having a hard time with some of them. So if you are an instructor and you have an undergraduate in your class who asks to be referred to by they, them, but you haven't really successfully used they, them before, it's kind of on you to get good at it. And you should practice in private rather than practicing in front of your student who is already vulnerable to you in a lot of ways. They don't need the added pressure of trying to teach you how to refer to them without being transphobic. So there's a lot of ways that you can practice this, and I think that linguists are in a position where we can and we should. This is another point. This is, a lot of this stuff is around pronouns, but I'm going to talk a little bit about other stuff too. One of the things that I would also ask people, especially if you are faculty in listening to this, is to correct others when they misgender someone. So this is something that I think should be standard practice, but I want to put it out there explicitly that if you hear someone misgendering anybody, you should correct them if you are safe to do so. If you think that you are not going to be retaliated against professionally in a way that like loses your livelihood or something, then you should go out there and say, you know, you need to use the right pronouns about the student that we are talking about or this colleague that we are talking about, but also like non-linguists too. This is something where the more that senior people are sort of setting this example, the more it will become a norm in the field, and this will drastically reduce the amount that people have to sort of tolerate daily microaggressions just in order to access an education. That's something that people shouldn't have to tolerate. And if you are not trans yourself, you still have ways of supporting the trans people around you by being really proactive about this. Similarly, this is something where you should call out transphobic comments when you see them. And this is something, especially if you see somebody who's very important saying something transphobic, especially if they're saying it sort of downhill at someone who is not as sort of hierarchically secure. This is something where you can use your position of relative security to correct people and also to sort of educate them. One of the frustrating things that I've been okay with it in my grad school experience, but I know that a lot of trans linguists get really tired of having to give a Trans 101 lecture every time they try to say like, hey, don't say that rude thing. And if our cis allies are doing some of that work for us, then it sort of relieves a lot of the cognitive load that is, it's something that we have to carry around, and it makes it harder to do grad school, it makes it harder to do research, and it also makes it harder to just be a person in the world. So this is something that you can help with. This one is a little bit less about pronouns and a little bit more about our position as scholars and researchers. When you're teaching, when you're in your reading group, when you are citing sources, I think it's really important for everybody, not just for the sort of niche trans linguists that there are, because there's not that many of us, but I think it's important for everybody to approach sort of foundational literature that we are required to read, approach it with a critical eye, and look for logical problems. If you are bringing in the understanding that trans people exist and are not lying and are not secretly trying to infiltrate bathrooms or anything, if you come in with that mindset, then a lot of research that we sort of teach in intro classes suddenly looks a little bit, it looks like there's some uncontrolled variables, and this is something that we can carefully and critically and thoughtfully discuss with our colleagues and with our students. But it's something that if it's more of an open discussion and we are talking about it more often, then it will be less of an issue where it's sort of only the 4 trans linguists who are just having our conversation on Twitter and nowhere else. This is something where everybody can participate. And this is something where you have a lot of opportunities to call out transphobia, but also to be critical about existing research, because if you're participating in linguistics as sort of a scholarly activity, then you're probably acting as an instructor and a reviewer and an editor and a researcher. We wear a lot of hats, and so there's a lot of opportunities to sort of deploy this power. And then the other thing that I would ask is that this is something that I've seen people getting better about, but include trans authors in your syllabus. This is something where if you're teaching a class called Language and Gender, and many linguistics departments have a language and gender class, you should not save all the trans stuff for the last week of the semester where you're trying to rush through it and it's kind of a footnote. And 2, you should include work by trans authors about trans issues. There's work that is by cis linguists that is still worth reading, but if it's only cis linguists talking about trans speakers on your syllabus, then that's sort of a weird position, and you should you should think to yourself, if I am a trans undergraduate thinking about going to grad school in linguistics, what does this say to me? And what it says to me is trans people don't get to be linguists, they get to be objects of study. And that's not something that fosters a good and diverse professional field. So because the majority of you answered that you are LGBT, I wanted to give some encouragement to, if you are a trans linguist out there, and if you are trying to be resilient and survive and do good research, I want to speak to you directly. One thing is that I would ask you to seek out peers at other institutions, not necessarily only at other institutions, but a lot of us will feel like, well, I'm the only one in my program. And that can be very, very isolating and alienating, and you don't have to feel that way. There are lots and lots of people who are trans and who are good linguists, and we go to conferences, and we are also on Twitter, and we have a Facebook group. And people who are at other institutions can still be a meaningful source of support and mentorship for you. So that would be the absolute first thing that I would do if I were you, is to try and make trans friends. And if you can't get them at home, go and get some online ones. The other thing is that sort of necessarily you are going to have to do a certain amount of giving the Trans 101 lecture, and in some ways we do have to sort of build up a callus to just sort of telling people what we wish they already knew. But the other thing is that you shouldn't let that force make you not do the research that you want to do. So if you are a trans linguist, but you really just want to be researching the semantics of relative clauses, and that has nothing to do with gender, then you get to do that. And you don't have to replace your whole sort of research interests and personal interests with just giving the Trans 101 lecture over and over again. The Trans 101 lecture is something that you should only have to give to each person once, and you should not let people derail you from what you actually want to be doing as a scholar. One of the sort of realities of being a trans linguist is that it's very, 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 very unlikely that you have a faculty advisor who is trans, because there are, I think we're up to 3 that I know of. And so if you are, I think for undergraduates and graduate students, who your advisor is and how you interact with them has a huge impact on what your experience is like in linguistics. And one of the things that I think, I'm speaking, I think, directly to PhD students here, but this applies to everybody, is that you can find cis advisors who can be empathetic and supportive. You should not work with advisors who are not empathetic and supportive. I will give you the sort of, what my experience has been is that advisors who don't have experience being trans, but they do have experience with prejudice on other sort of dimensions, will be able to sort of use their experience to inform their empathy and support you. And it doesn't have to be a one-to-one analogy, but it can still be really powerful as a way to connect with your advisor. And it means that your advisor is going to ideally be understanding of the fact that your life is harder than a cis linguist's is, sort of on average, and they should be nice to you. You should not work with an advisor who's not nice to you. If your advisor is not getting better over time, so a lot of us have to pick advisors in our first year, and we don't know faculty that well. If your advisor is not getting better over time, you should switch. This is like something that I advise people a lot, and it's very rarely that people take my advice on this, but for real, if they are not growing and learning, you can get a different advisor, and you should do it sooner rather than later, because the later you are in the process, the harder it is to disentangle. Oh, sorry. this is something where if you are a trans linguist and you need support, this is something where you should just like straight up contact me directly and we'll talk. But I just wanted to put these resources out there for you if you are sort of not sure yet, if you need this support. The support is available. I think this is my final slide. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about, so I've talked about how to conduct ourselves as sort of professional colleagues, how to conduct ourselves as students and linguists trying to make our way in the world. And I want to talk a little bit about how to conduct ourselves as researchers in not doing research that reinforces transphobic ideology. So don't start with a transphobic research question. A transphobic research question would be something like, how well can listeners discriminate cis women from trans women? That's a bad research question because the premise, the underlying premise of your research question is that there is a fundamental difference between cis women and trans women. And that sucks. So don't start there. If you are interested in trans linguistics as a research issue, you should probably talk to a trans person about how to develop a research question that is interesting and serves the trans community. Unconflate sex and gender in your mind and in your experiment design. So this is something where this actually applies to everybody doing sort of sociolinguistics or anything where there are social variables involved, where you should consider whether you are actually asking a question about sex or gender. And if you're not asking a question about sex, then you shouldn't include sex as part of your sort of demographic survey. And if you think that what you're studying might be related to both sex and gender, you should probe those differently and carefully. And you should theoretically support that experiment design with a theoretical framework that it would be explanatory. So if you do find that there's a variable that correlates with sex and not gender, you need to explore why that might be, because sex is an extremely broad term, and in terms of what linguists are actually talking about, there's no reason to think that the way that somebody's doctor interpreted their genitals at birth does not influence the way that they speak as an adult. That's not a reasonable hypothesis. I have a lot more work that you can look at about that. Oh, okay. I would ask you to be thoughtful about discussing gendered language in your research and look at how trans people are using that language for themselves. And I would ask you to get input from trans scholars on trans issues and also pass it on to your students, all of your students. You should not assume that you can tell which of your students are trans. But this is something that will seriously improve your research. And I think, yes, this is my last slide. I have some links for resources about translinguistics, and I am finally realizing that I'm a million hours behind. I'm sorry. So I'm going to turn the screen over somehow to Tyler. How do I do that? I've done that.
Okay. So we're quite a bit behind schedule, which is quite all right. Which I prepared for this. I've made my slides incredibly detailed, and my research is fairly esoteric. On those slides, you can find resources about getting engaged with the community, getting engaged with linguistics and out in STEM, and various other LGBTQ organizations. My email's on there as well, so feel free to contact me. But I think we're going to move straight into question and answers. So thank you, Jeremy and Kirby, for your great talks and really important topics too. So I was going to provide my perspective as a gay cisgender linguist, but obviously that already has quite a large platform. So it's much more important to hear about these issues. So thank you for being able to be on the webinar today. And so I'm going to turn it over to David, and he's going to lead us into the question and answers.
Okay, again, thanks to everybody. Those presentations were great. So we're ready for Q&A now. And if you want to ask a question, again, your microphones are disabled. So you will see a little question widget on your GoToWebinar dashboard, and you can use that to answer the questions. Again, if your question is for a specific panelist, just let us know that. Take it away. And also for, you'll see the handouts widget on your webinar, and that is where you can get Tyler's handout as well as Kirby's and Jeremy's. And Kirby, could you put your webcam up again?
Yes. Hello.
There you are. Okay, great. Okay, any questions coming in? Okay, someone has said it's not really a question, just an interesting article intersecting queer post-colonial linguistic identities in Ireland, and I'm going to share that with all of you. There's a chat widget on your that I will put it in, and I think you should be able to see it there. So I'm just sending that now. Okay, and here's the comment. I think it's not specified, but it is really for you, Tyler. How can we get involved with the LGBTQ plus LSA Special Interest Group?
So you can email me. My email is tyler.e.kibbe@gmail.com, and that should be on the PowerPoint. You just email me, I'll add you to the listserv. The only requirement is that you're an LSA member. And we have different initiatives that are going on right now. So as we move into applying for committee status, hopefully we're going to establish some LGBTQ travel grants for the annual meeting. We're working on developing an LGBTQ language pamphlet, as well as we're working with the committee on the status of women in linguistics on LGBTQ mentoring initiatives. We're always looking for new members and people who are willing to help out with new initiatives. If you have any ideas, that's also great. Yeah, just email me and we can get you put into the group.
Okay, great. Let's see, then we have, here we are. This question is for Kirby.
Yeah.
Do you think it's possible to balance encouraging cis allies to state their pronouns and normalizing stating pronouns in general, and not making the burden harder for closeted trans people and gender questioning people when you have no way of knowing which is which by the very nature of the thing? If so, how might you balance this? I ran into this often as a closeted trans person, and I was still questioning what pronouns I even wanted to use. I ended up half coming out in my local LGBT space earlier than I was ready to, because of the expectation that allies will state their pronouns, when I didn't know what I wanted, but was too uncomfortable proclaiming my pronouns as those of my AGAB assigned gender at birth. Even though that's what people would use anyway, if I didn't, I still felt different somehow. Is dealing with this just part of being trans in general? Even though it was an accepting environment, I still wish I could have waited until I was ready.
I think this is a really excellent question. It's one I've about with instructors in other departments, because it's sort of it's very relevant in the academic environment in general, where it's becoming more the norm. I would say that what the norm should be is that if someone volunteers their pronouns, then you know, and if someone doesn't volunteer their pronouns, you don't push them. So I would say that what happened to you, where you were sort of forced into a situation of coming out earlier than you were ready for, is something that we should not be putting our students or colleagues through at all. That's not appropriate. So I think where I've sort of settled with this is that when I teach like a small undergraduate class, and I want to know what pronouns to use about all my students. What I do is I start with introducing my own pronouns, and I say, if you want to share your pronouns, you can, and then I don't bug anybody about it. And I've sort of arrived at that conclusion through trial and error, which is not ideal. The other way that sort of specific to instructors that you can do is that you can, when I teach a small enough class that I can go through answers like this, I do like an anonymous quiz online, or not anonymous to me, but anonymous to each other, so they can't see their answers. But asking people, like, what pronouns would you like me to use for you in class? And I have sort of a box of, is there anything else you think is important for me to know? So this is obviously very specific for being a college instructor, but it's one of the situations where it comes up a lot. Outside of being a college instructor, I think if like 75% of the people at the giant conference already put a pronoun sticker on their name tag, and then we don't bug anybody who didn't do it, that would be normal enough. And then there's sort of the implication of, like, if I don't have a pronoun sticker, there's probably a reason for it, but also not necessarily. So it's not something where I think we should be requiring people to answer one way or the other when they're not sure, when they're not comfortable sharing that information. Thank you for that question. It's a really important one.
Okay, great. Thank you. I also wanted to remind you in the audience that even though Jeremy is not on cam because of technical difficulties, he's still with us until 2:30. So if you have any questions for Jeremy, please do ask them now. We've got another question here for Kirby. In the meantime, you shared great ideas about practicing non-gendered pronoun use. What do you say about using they as a generic pronoun?
As a generic pronoun, that is well established in the English language. I think that sometimes people end up getting in fights with editors about it, and the editors are always being ridiculous prescriptivists, like literally always. There's no reason to sort of force the issue. They has been a generic pronoun since literally like 1300. So you can do it if you want. If you don't do it, that doesn't, when people use generic he as an alternative to generic they, the studies show that the readers or listeners do get a gendered interpretation. So you're not being gender neutral when you're just using he. When you're using sort of he or she, you are explicitly setting up a binary choice that excludes people like me. If you want to do that, I'm not the language police, but just know that I'm going to read your writing and say, oh, well, this is not for me then. And if you're getting in a fight with like your instructors who don't want you to use generic they, then there are many really good sort of descriptive accounts of generic they and its long history that you can point to, and then also do whatever you have to do to not get punished for your writing. So, but generic they has been in the language for a really, really, really long time. So just use it.
Okay, we've got a little technical question here, which I'll go ahead and answer myself. Someone's asking to be directed to the handouts. So don't worry if you don't see them or can't download them. We'll have a web page up on the LSA website that will have links to the handouts. But you should see a GoToWebinar dashboard. It will have audio instructions on it, which would have directed you to either call in by phone or use your computer's audio. Somewhere under that, you should see a little thing that says handouts, and you can click on the arrow to expand that, and you should see the 3 handouts there. Again, don't worry if you don't see those right away or if you have trouble downloading them. I'll make those available on a web page later on. So we have a question here. It says, greetings from Argentina. I have a question for Kirby. So Kirby, you are the person of the hour. You mentioned struggle in languages with gendered nouns, pronouns, articles, adjectives, etc. In Spanish, we as an LGBTQ+ community are trying to promote the use of the E suffix to erase the gender mark in these words instead of A for feminine and O for masculine. being something that affects many elements in the sentence and something that makes discourse sound very different to what speakers are used to, it has been super looked down on in the media and society in general. Do you think this artificial solution can ever be successful in the academic world?
I am so excited about, so to confirm, that's orthographic E, but like the phonetic ending is like A, right? David, you see the written version of the question, so you can confirm
I would assume so, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yes.
So
Yes.
there has been a little bit of research from sociolinguists on this matter. I can, the resources section of my last slide has a link to a Google Drive thing where we are sort of developing an annotated bibliography of non-binary language use in various languages. And so the A ending is something that I've seen talked about a little bit. The first thing that I want to say is that it's absolutely not artificial. Language users deciding to do something to protect themselves from prejudice or to make themselves feel like a part of the language is not artificial. And they're not imposing it on anybody. So trans and non-binary people and anybody who's sort of wants to support those people using the A ending as a truly gender neutral Spanish sort of morphosyntactic marker. For one thing, it is built on morphosyntactic analogy with stuff that was already in Spanish, so it's not just coming out of nowhere. And then second of all, if people are doing it, then it's a real part of the language. And one of the problems with sort of Spanish is that there is this like really institutionalized, really, really strong prescriptive force that's like, well, it's not the correct Spanish and you are bad, but I'm here to tell you that you're not bad, you're good, and it's not artificial and it's not fake, and you should use it as much as you want to. And I love it. Thank you.
Okay, I was a question for Jeremy, but Jeremy, I think you have gone now. Is that right? It sounds like Jeremy had to leave right at as the webinar was finished. But we can. So we'll. I think their contact information is probably on their slides, so you can send them the question there. We do have another question here, another one for Kirby. Do you think there's a better way to work with the variable of gender in sociolinguistics research so as to include / not alienate trans folk? At some point, I only put gender, : and then a blank in a form for people to fill in however they wanted. But what do we do when we have to process the information of non-binary, trans, and cis folk for the analysis?
Yeah, so I have a couple answers to that. One of them is that Lal Zimin has been sort of doing really good work about establishing practices of how to collect gender information in a way that you can operationalize. So it's really hard when you're sort of caught in the bind of, I don't want to tell people what categories are the options, but also I do need to make a bar chart at the end of this research project. So I'm going to need to put them in categories at some point. There's a few ways that you can do it. Having it as an open-ended question is probably the best way if you are getting under 100 participants. If you are getting over 100 participants, you should do that. And as part of your consent form, let people know that you'll be sort of lumping people into however many categories. You can give them the option of like 3 categories. So like man, woman, neither of these. And then have a fill in the blank. What Lal has been doing has been having like sliding scales of how feminine and how masculine as separate scales, not as feminine on one end and masculine on the other. But here's 0 to 10, how feminine do you perceive your own gender identity, and 0 to 10, how masculine do you perceive your own gender identity. So having sliding scales is a great way of having quantifiable data without putting people into forced sort of binaries. But I think one of the other things that I would say is that if you think gender is going to be a super important variable for your research, especially sociolinguists should be incorporating that into doing a little bit of ethnographic digging. So you should ask questions while you're talking to your participants about if you think gender is important, ask them about their gender ideology, ask them what they think it means to be a man or a woman, and like talk about that, and you're going to get a lot more rich and informative responses.
Great. I think we have time for one more question, and there is a Tyler question.
Hey.
Thank you.
The first your slides, Tyler. For Tyler, having looked at your slides, how do you respond to the claim, "This is not really linguistics," when it comes up?
So even just looking at LGBTQ linguistics research, right? So there's this idea that if it's not purely theoretical, if it's not what we would consider traditional or you know, more 19th century linguistics, right? Then it's not real linguistics. And I think that that's just completely ridiculous. It's sort of elitist and gatekeeping. But on the other side, we also have this work where we have organizational work or advocacy work and outreach work that's not considered legitimate linguistics work. It doesn't really get counted towards tenure track positions. You don't see it listed on CVs. And I would say that's the more I guess dangerous territory is when we start seeing our moral obligations, what we're actually trying to give back to the community, the platforms we're trying to build, the way we're trying to actually organize around these issues. When we stop considering that, or if we don't even consider that real linguistics work, legitimate linguistics work, then we've abdicated our morality on those issues. You know, if you're not a member of a marginalized community, then you're just contributing to the further marginalization of those groups by not legitimizing that work. And so traditionally, cisgender white straight men, right? They don't have to do any of this organizational work around these issues. So traditionally, it hasn't been counted as legitimate work because it's never come up in the first place. But now, increasingly, so we see the foundation of COSWEL, so the Committee on Status of Women in Linguistics, and then CEDL, so the Committee for Ethnic Diversity in Linguistics, and now the Special Interest Group. Slowly over time, we're starting to organize around these issues, start to work together as intersectional communities, as communities with common interests and goals. And yeah, so it is legitimate linguistics. It is real linguistics, as long as you're through the study of language and language science, as long as you're giving back to those communities and conducting meaningful research, you should continue doing that research no matter what anyone says.
Okay, thank you, everybody. I think we are pretty much out of time. So thanks to Jeremy, who had to leave, and thank you very much, Tyler and Kirby, for being here. Thanks to all of you who attended and for taking the time out of your day to be here. If you had a question that wasn't able to be answered, please get in touch with the presenter or presenters. Again, this webinar is recorded, and we'll have a recording of it available on the LSA YouTube channel either later this afternoon or by Monday at the latest. And we'll have links to the handouts if you weren't able to get them from here. Again, thanks everybody, and have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.